Good evening. Welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, and answering your questions tonight, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg. Author and advertising creative, Dee Madigan. Fijian women's advocate, Virisila Buadromo. Rising Labor star, Ed Husic, the first Muslim elected to federal parliament. And Queensland University Professor of Law, James Allan. Please welcome our panel. Thank you, and Q&A is simulcast on ABC News 24 News Radio. You can join the Twitter conversation using the Quanda hashtag. Remember, if you have a live question, add @Quanda to help us find it. Well, our first question tonight comes from Virginia Gordon.
Thank you. My question's to Ed and to Josh. We love your so-called bromance, the Husic as it's well known. Is this a sign of new generation politics? And when you both lead your party, which I'm sure you will we finally see a new kind of polity?
Josh, you can start.
Well, it's true, Ed and I do get on well. Okay.
We rehearsed this for a reason.
That's right. No, we do get on well.
And How did that happen?
Well, we started being interviewed...
miracles occur.
Yeah, miracles occur, exactly. We started being interviewed together and then we started talking off air and we ended up sharing a meal and then we just became good mates and our wives met each other. And I think the message in that, and we're not unique, by the way, there are some other very good friendships across the political aisle, is that whether you're Labor, Liberal, indeed Green or Independent, you've come to Parliament and into politics for the right reasons. You want to make Australia a better place. We disagree about what is the best route there, but we undoubtedly all have the best of intentions. And so when you get to know other people, and including in my case with Ed, you develop a good friendship. And it was said by Arthur Fadden, who was a former Prime Minister but also head of the Country Party, when he said to James Killen, in politics, all the good bowlers aren't on one team. And I think it's a truism in that there are some very good people, some very good politicians, and on all sides of politics. And you know, I think in our case it's been a healthy thing because as you look at across the political divide in Parliament, there is a bit of animosity, and having good friendships across the aisle does make for a more healthier environment.
Now, is it true that your mother thinks that Ed here is a lovely boy and would like to invite him home for chicken soup?
Well, in past tense, she did think he was a lovely boy, and he did come...
What's that mean?
No, I don't.
Past tense?
No, I
so she doesn't think that anymore?
I meant that she invited you, you came, and he and his wife, Bridget, were great company, and I, with my wife, had the good fortune of getting a Bosnian barbecue over at Ed's place, and the food was pretty good there too. So.
Ed, let me bring you in to sort of talk about the question, really, and this fine bromance that you two have, because it is so unusual.
Gabrielle Chan uses one term once. Gabrielle Chan now writes for The Guardian. Never forgive it.
How has it gone down on your side of politics? Because it is quite unusual.
Look, I have, as a general rule through life, always taken the view I don't let my friends work out who my other friends should be. And so you take people as they come. And this whole issue, though, I'm interested in it insofar as it's, it's almost like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. If I was to ask people, can Australian politics do with more division, the answer resoundingly would be no, we don't need any more. But if you start to obviously try to find ways to work together. Some people think, oh, well, that's just, they have this sort of conspiratorial take. Well, that's just the major parties, behind the scenes they work everything out and they just put on this show for the general public. So are you thinking
of helping them get their budget through the Senate, for example? I mean, that's where the rubber hits the road when it comes to political friendships.
Yeah, they're going to need all the help they can with that budget. They're not going to get that way from me or from my colleagues. But certainly, I do think it's important to be able to find common ground with people, and I get on famously with Josh. Whenever he doesn't talk politics, we get on great. That's true. That's the same with you and me. Right?
But let me just reflect on this for a minute, though, because you're a great admirer of Paul Keating, I think it's fair to say, and Paul Keating had very few friends across the aisle. In actual fact, he destroyed or attempted to destroy a lot of people across the aisle through his style, his wit, his aggression, all of those things which are synonymous with the politics that we know today.
Yeah, but I mean, at the same time too, it's obviously there are a lot of things that you can learn from Paul Keating, and particularly in terms of what he applied in the policy perspective, and clearly a lot of people remember for the way he performed in Parliament. But I would just hope to, in my own way, be my own person and be remembered for things that I do in the time that I have in politics. But I'm a very big admirer of Paul Keating's, Bob Hawke's, a lot of Labor Prime Ministers. I'm working on your side, but there's not that many I can really sort of comfortably say.
Well, you could start with Sir Robert Menzies, for example.
Yeah, OK, he's far enough. Yeah, OK, Robert Menzies.
Malcolm Fraser's doing OK too.
Dee Madigan, you're listening to this. Are you buying it? Is it something you could sell, for example, as an idea that politicians from either side of the aisle could actually get on as decent human beings, as opposed to what we've seen over many years?
Yes, look, they can. I don't think there's anything wrong with a good bit of fighting. I think ideology is worth fighting for, but you play the policy and not the man. And I think at the end of the day, you can have genuine friendships. But I think people get a little bit scared about this. They say it's too divisive, it's too rough. And I think we're a young democracy and a really robust democracy. And I think sometimes ideas are worth getting passionate about. So I don't have a huge problem with it.
Jim Allan.
Well, we're not a young democracy. Actually, we're one of the oldest in the world. That shows you how few democracies there are. But I think we're about the 5th oldest democracy in the world. But I mean, the comments are all great, and of course we'd like people to reach across the aisle. When Ed was speaking, it reminded me that, of course, almost everything that Paul Keating and Bob Hawke are known for, all their great reforms happened because the coalition passed those things through the legislature. When you try to think of examples of when the coalition wants something through and Labor passes them through, you come up with nothing, really. So there is, you do want people to
were
get
you
along.
around for the hung parliament, by the way?
Yeah, I was going to say, they helped us a lot on carbon price. That was a really good piece of cooperation.
No, but that's because carbon tax is one of the dumbest ideas ever, to be totally honest. One of the dumbest ideas. There are 190 countries in the world. Just about 30 have some sort of carbon tax or emissions trading scheme, and of those, 28 are in the EU, and it's just a meaningless thing. So you're really talking about 3 or 4 countries. We have the world's highest carbon tax.
We've gotten into an area that we weren't actually discussing by accident.
I didn't bring it up.
Virisila, Fijian politics. Do you see any sort of reflection of Australian politics in Fiji? I mean, you have a bit of a problem, of course, when things go wrong, they have a coup. But apart from that,
I think that there is, hopefully there's something that our our politicians could learn from Australia, which is one, the fact that let us all, get together and go into parliamentary democracy as soon as possible, September the 15th. And I think that all the politicians, I think not only the politicians, but I also think that the citizens are working very hard to ensure and hold the current government accountable to their promise of having elections. And I think...
Is it possible to have bipartisanship with someone who effectively took government by force?
I think that you have to start somewhere. I think that I think we can't be at opposite sides all the time and expect to forge a vision for the country. I think that everything has to start from a relationship. You don't have to like each other, but I think you have to learn to trust each other and respect each other. And then in that way, we can progress the country forward. And I think that that's exactly what's going on here. This is what respect is about. And I hope that the politicians back home could learn a little bit about that. OK,
let's move on to our next question, which is on a related topic. It's from Ben Teager.
Thanks, Tony. Australia is often lauded as a great multicultural society. However, my experience as a Jewish Australian is that interdating and intermarriage should be avoided and can often be condemned. Mr. Frydenberg, according to the statistics, approximately 1 in 5 Australian Jews will intermarry. And Mr. Husic, according to the same statistics, approximately 1 in 10 Australian Muslims will intermarry. Should interdating and intermarriage be encouraged as a means of increasing social harmony, cohesion and tolerance? Or put differently, can we all get along by getting it on?
I'll start with you, Josh. We hasten to add that your bromance is purely platonic.
I want you to answer the last bit first.
Look, in terms of relationships, there's only one thing that matters, and that's the respect and the love between 2 people. And that's regardless of religion. And so I have lots of friends who were Jewish, who married people who were not Jewish, and some converted, some didn't. And they're all welcomed as friends, as members of the community, and I think that's a good thing. So,
is there community pressure, though? I mean, for example, within your own family, would it have been welcome if you had decided to marry a Muslim, for example?
I don't think there would have been a problem at all, because my parents have enough confidence in me to choose the right partner for life. And that's the upbringing that I had got at home. So my parents never ever put any pressure on me in terms of the partner in life that I needed to take. They said I was taking quite a while because I didn't get married to my late 30s, but you know, that's a bit of mother pressure, and lots of people get that. But in terms of the choice of partner, there was never any pressure whatsoever.
Ed?
So my folks immigrated here from the former Yugoslavia, and back there, marriage between, my folks are from a Bosnian Muslim background, but between Serbs and Croats was quite commonplace. And so it wasn't really an issue for me growing up, given the background that my folks came from. And my wife has parents who are English and Irish, and she herself is Catholic. And it's never, from our perspective, it's not been an issue whatsoever. So that obviously comes back in terms of the background. I think what Josh said is absolutely correct in terms of the basis of marriage being on one founded on love, and that relatives, family, close family want to see that succeed. So it's been commonplace, but I can't answer from the last point. That last bit, you finished that's perfect. So I don't think anything can beat that.
Virisila, obviously there's been huge problems in Fiji, ethnic problems, ethnic divisions. Does intermarriage help change that in any way?
Well, I'm married to a Gujarati Muslim, and I am Indigenous Fijian, and I'm Christian. I think that, intermarriages is becoming quite a common thing back home. It's not just between people of different races or of different religions. I mean, I do think that that's what makes the world go round. It's different people, different religions. I mean, if we were all the same kind of people, it'd be pretty boring. And I'm glad I married someone who's different from me in terms of religion, ethnicity, but we're very similar in the sense that we have the same kind of vision, we have the same sort of passion. And as both gentlemen have pointed out, our relationship is built on respect and love, and I think that that's the most important thing in terms of relationships and of building relationships.
Let's bring Dee in here. Are you married to another advertising executive?
No, he's a mechanic biker, but he's rugby union and I'm AFL, and we make it work. I think there's enough pressure on marriages without trying to use them as a tool to affect social change.
Fair enough. Jim?
Well, I can probably top that. I come from a long line of Scots Canadians, and I'm married to a long line of English Canadians, and if you think that's not open-minded, then you're wrong. But look, I feel like I'm part of this, incredibly enlightened group that is all telling everyone how wonderful we all are. I took the question to be moderately more serious than all of us showing our wonderful credentials here. It's a worry in the U.S. for, say, Jews that a lot of people are marrying out of the faith. There's lots of articles written on it, and the problem amounts to, at some point, you dissipate a 2,000 or 3,000-year-old culture, and so it's not. It's all very well and good to say this, but that's not what the worry is. The worry is that if enough people marry out of the faith, that you've got nothing left, and that can be a worry. So, especially for Jewish people, where you're only looking at 7 or 8 million in the U.S. and basically that in Israel. So, yes, of course, we all want to be the cutting edge of enlightenment and happy, clappy wonderfulness, but. There is a serious point to the question.
Are you saying there's a survival of the culture element to the way you think about it?
Well, of course there is for certain groups. Yes, I think that's obvious, right?
Ed, what do you think about that?
I think in terms of faith, people, it's very individual, and people will find their faith in their own way. And
just going back to the questioner, though, he asked, he had those statistics. Now, 1 in 10 Australian Muslims marry outside of the faith, as it were. So why is it such a narrow group, do you think?
Well, I mean,
it's a similar thing that James is saying here.
Well, I have to say, Tony, I mean, it's not something that I've discussed with people of my faith. I just was sort of more reflecting on the comments that Jim was making, and also in terms of the question itself. And I think people, the strongest faith is the one that's individually felt rather than imposed. And I think people do, particularly in terms of our own backgrounds, try to encourage someone to learn where their parents came from, where their grandparents came from, and have some of that culture move forward through generations. It's absolutely tough, but it depends on the commitment of parents to how they will actually manage that whole issue. It's not easy.
But Ed, there's 1 billion plus Muslims. There's more than that Christians. When you start talking about 15 or 16 million Jews, it's just a different question.
Let me go back to the questioner, Ben. Listening to that, listening to what James is saying, does that sort of ring true from your ideas of your own community?
To some extent. It's difficult to be candid about this topic when amongst your own community, lest on national television. But I think that's right. But
you did start it.
Right, that's right. No, I think what the professor picked up on was sort of the tenor of my question, because we all like to think of ourselves as somewhat enlightened, but the statistics tell a different story.
Okay, let's. Well, actually, there's someone with a hand up there. We'll go down to. We'll quickly get the microphone down to you. Yes, go ahead.
It's quite relevant in the world context and human rights, because Maryam Ibrahim in Sudan is being tried, and she's had her little boys in prison with her for being charged for marrying out of Islam to a Christian. So if we're really concerned about this as a human right, then we're gonna have to start thinking about humans in general and the world
Very
scale.
good point. Well, Ed was nodding there, so do you want to pick up that?
Well, I agree. I mean, the bottom line should always be respecting people's human rights. And no one, I feel, has a right to use their religion to breach someone else's human rights in that way. And so I think you'll find a lot of people, regardless of faith, will feel just as strongly. So that's why I agreed with the points you were making.
Okay, let's move on. We've got quite a few questions to get through. You're watching Q&As live. It's interactive. Our next question comes from Antonina Ayono.
Virisila, Buadromo, Pacific Islander youth today face heavy strain in relation to higher education because most are New Zealand passport holders. There are also stereotypes such as we're the class clowns or the sporty group of students, and also due to the fact that we always want to place our families at the forefront of our many priorities by choosing employment to provide for the family over seeking higher education. So, what is your advice and words of encouragement in empowering the Pasifika young people that education is an aspect that they should aim for despite financial, citizenship status, stereotypes, and family expectations?
Virisila.
I think education is very, very important. I think there's few exceptional people who get by in the world without education. And I think that it's not, the issues that you've raised isn't specific to Pacific Islanders. I think it's specific to any immigrant who comes to any country. It's hard trying to fit in. I think the important thing here is just to work really hard, be very clear about what it is that you want to study, and aim for that. I think that's the important thing. I think it's also important to understand where you come from, your roots, your culture, because that's what makes you different. But at the same time, also understand the culture that you're living in, your new culture that you're living in, and try and figure out a way on how you can assimilate that. Because I think that the people that you're living with now in Australia could learn a lot from you as a Pacific Islander, the same way that you could learn a lot from Australians. As I said before, I think that, what makes the world go around is different people. And, trying to say that, let's try and find things that we have in common rather than trying to find things that make us different. And I think that as young Pacific Islanders, I think that the fact that you come from the Pacific, you have a long history, is an important thing that you should share with Australians. But at the same time, I think you really should focus on education, because that's one of the few things that really gets you ahead in life.
Dee, I'll bring you in on the stereotyping question, and of course the ABC may be a little bit responsible for some of that itself. It's got a TV program called Jonah from Tonga, in which a white comedian plays a young Tongan school kid. What do you think? I mean, you're hearing the young lady saying that Pacific Islanders are considered class clowns. I guess we're not helping.
No, we're not. And it's one of those sort of self-perpetuating things. When you think that that's who you are, you tend to play up to that as well. And it's so important, particularly for girls, and this is in all cultures, when they get an education, it actually changes their entire family and their culture. And we know that through African nations, you're actually better off educating the girls than the boys, because that's what, if the mother's educated, they're more likely to have their children educated, they're more likely to provide better nutrition and things like that. So in all societies, education for girls is probably the most important thing.
Josh?
Well, hard to disagree with that. And I mean, I was just following what a lady called Sheryl Sandberg has recently written. She wrote a book called Lean In, which she was talking about women more generally, not talking about in the Pacific Islands or that part of the world. But what she was saying is that, you know, women need to capitalise on the opportunities that are available. And often men will see success and will claim the credit for that, whereas when women have success, they'll put it down to external factors. And so I think that's a broader point if you want to talk about women in our societies, that, you know, women should be, in Sheryl Sandberg's words, leaning in and trying to grab the opportunities that are available and not be seen as second best.
She also said, I wish little girls who were told they were bossy were told they had leadership skills instead, which was such a lovely thing.
That's a nice way to put it.
Ed, I mean, a lot of Pacific Islanders in your
I was actually going to make that point. The view that you had expressed has been expressed to me as a Member of Parliament. The seat that I represent in Western Sydney is home to a lot of Samoans, Tongans, Pacific Islanders, you know, from across various countries. And actually the older members, the older generation is concerned about the very things that you raised tonight. And in particular, that young people would leave their education earlier, not because necessarily they want to be the class clown or because they're not into education. They're doing it because of a strong sense of family. They want to be able to provide, and so they leave education too soon. And the worry is that they then, you know, when tough economic times hit, they're the first people that are targeted for redundancy and to be pushed out the door. So it is something, I have to say, Tony, that has caught the attention of people in my neck of the woods. They do want to work with younger people to encourage them and to start building that sense of, it's, you know, really in your best interest, in the community's best interest, to stay on as long as you can, build up your skills, and this will be better for you longer term.
I'm just going to go. We've got a question that's come in on Twitter. It's from Juan Carlos El Mico. It's 13, I believe. What do Pacific Islanders think of Jonah from Tonga? And we've got a few Pacific Islanders in the audience. If you want to put up your hand and get involved in that, that's fine. But let's hear, first of all, Virisila. I don't know if you've heard of Jonah from Tonga, but what do you think of the concept of a white comedian playing a young Tongan schoolboy?
Sorry, he's not a Tongan?
No, he's not a Tongan, no. He's a white Anglo-Saxon comedian who effectively paints himself as a Tongan and behaves as if he were one.
That's quite offensive. Could they find a Tongan?
He pretends that he's a Tongan.
Oh, he pretends to be a Tongan. Well, I think that's a question you should ask the Tongans, whether they find that offensive.
No, I just, well, I don't know if there's anyone from the Pacific Islands who'd like to respond to that. If there is, put up your hand. No? OK, look, let's move on to our next one. In fact, James, I didn't get you in on this subject.
Oh, well, there were two aspects to the question. The first half was sort of personal advice. I'm probably the wrong guy to ask for personal advice. I've been very lucky in life, and I had great parents and stuff. I'm a bit skeptical that anybody tunes into a TV show and then changes their life, but maybe I'm wrong. On the thing, though, I want to.
Well, you're wrong when it comes to Q&A.
I think Dee's wrong about something,
put a
though.
pin in that balloon.
The thing Dee said, she's making it out as if girls aren't doing well today at university. Let me tell you, it's the exact opposite. Girls are dominating in the elite universities in law and medicine.
But not when they get to the jobs,
well,
though.
But
not
hang
when
on,
they get
it's
to
two
the
steps.
companies.
Let me finish. The first step is universities, and 20 years ago, this just wasn't true. And now, if anything, there's a problem for boys in universities, to be totally honest, and the good universities. Now, whether this will play out in 20 years down the road for work, I don't know. But certainly, in terms of, you know, painting it as if we have to worry about girls in education, it's not true in Canada. It's not true in Australia. It's not true in the U.S. I don't think it's true anywhere in the developed world these days. Girls are doing really well.
I suppose we could segue into the idea of how more difficult it'll be when university degrees are 30 to 50% more expensive. But that's a subject we may come to later. Our next question is on a very different subject. It's from Bob Vinicum.
A question for the panel. Now that Iraq has descended into civil war, does all the panel agree that the toppling of the Saddam Hussein regime, under which all the factions of Islam and the Christians lived together in a relative harmony, which was toppling engineered by Tony Blair and George Bush and the neocons, you all agree that was a war crime of monumental proportions?
Josh.
Well, I don't think you can say that the people of Iraq under Saddam Hussein lived in harmony. And if you wind the clock back to 2003, when the decision was taken to go to war, it was in the shadow of 9/11, and for Australians, it was after we lost more than 80 Australians in the Bali bombing in 2002. And the greatest threat to the world at that time was seen as nuclear terrorism. Now, Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons against the Kurds in the north and against the Shiites in the south. He was obstructing the weapons inspectors. He was paying $25,000 to every family of a Palestinian suicide bomber.
Quick question, were there any chemical weapons in the end?
Well, they were never found. They were never found, but as inquiry after inquiry found, the only government at that time who didn't think he had had chemical or biological weapons was actually the government of Iraq. Every country, even the ones who opposed the war, the French, the Germans, Kevin Rudd said it was a matter of empirical fact. Now, the question is, did we make mistakes after we went into Iraq? Absolutely. The de-Baathification of that country, when that was the major institution, taking down the army and allowing all these military-trained people to go out into the community and basically be conscripted by terrorist organisations, they were big mistakes. And now we have a really big problem, because you're right, there's a fragmentation of Iraq between Shiites and Sunnis. I think one person who is going to come under the microscope now is the Prime Minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, because he really has governed for the Shiite majority, not for the Sunni minority. He's purged the military and the parliament of his opponents, and he's helped bring this thing on. And now it's a global problem. It is an Australian problem, because our security...
Of course, it was the Americans who gave him a leg up into power originally.
Yeah.
So,
and
once again, a series of mistakes when you
Sure.
manipulate who's going to be in government.
And hindsight's a beautiful thing, but absolutely. There were lots of mistakes that were made. In fact, the Americans wanted to keep more troops there, but Maliki, under pressure from the Iranians and others, said no. So I'm looking at the current situation and I am very worried. Right. I'm worried, one, about the humanitarian disaster, 500,000 people fleeing from Mosul on our TV screens, the brutal killings, the mass rapes. This is a real problem. The second thing is, if Iraq stays fragmented and Mosul and Tikrit and those other places do not come back to the government per se, Iraq will turn out like Afghanistan, and then it becomes the HQ for world terrorism, and we know that hurts Australia. Right. So that's a big problem.
Right. Yeah, but the question isn't just, there's not, with respect, just one question of did we make mistakes when we went in. The other question is, should we have gone in? And
the question that was asked, I'll just bring you right back to the question that was asked. Was it a monumental war crime? That's what the questioner asked.
Look, I mean, in terms of that, there's a whole legal definition about what constitutes a war crime. But from my perspective and from a lot of people's perspective, the basis for going into Iraq changed. It went from weapons of mass destruction to links with Al-Qaeda, which then didn't eventuate. And we went in there, and then it leads to your second question of once we did go in as the part of the sort of coalition of the willing, as it was described, what happened as a result of that? Now, certainly, and I know there'll be differences of opinion on this, there was definitely a need for us to attend to Afghanistan. And we've previously discussed this. But the whole issue of Iraq now is that we upended that country, and now we're confronted with very serious events there, which may compel us potentially, you don't know what the engagement will be from this point onwards. But when Josh made reference to the fact of the humanitarian concerns, we've also had humanitarian concerns in another part, in another country, in Syria, where people are worried about what's happened in Syria and the impact that it's had on Lebanon as well. I mean, and these have been tough areas, and the problem's been, the world hasn't been able to respond effectively on Syria, and now we're also being potentially pressed as to what do we do in Iraq. And this doesn't downplay the seriousness of it, very serious. But, when we went into Iraq, a lot of people were seriously worried about what long-term ramification would unfurl as a result of this. And And I hate to think that we're seeing the consequences of this now.
James.
Look, Bob, Saddam Hussein was a monster. He was worse than Gaddafi in Libya. He was far worse. He killed far, far more people than the Serbs did in Bosnia. He was a monster. Now, we live in a hard world. You're making tough choices. I don't know if it was the right choice, but it was a tough, they haven't gone into Syria. Maybe they should have. I think they shouldn't personally, but it's a hard call. It's a hard call to know what to do about Saddam Hussein. And to use ridiculous phrases like monumental war crime, it was a very tough call. Personally, I wouldn't have gone into Iraq. I would have possibly gone into Saudi Arabia myself after 9/11, but it was a very tough call. You can't use hindsight.
You're the law professor. Was it a legal call?
Well, they had, it's international law is fairly amorphous and vague, and he had an opinion. You can get an opinion from any barrister you want on almost anything. So it's a very difficult call.
Are you saying, in fact, it might have been illegal?
Well, look, if you want to use international law to bomb somebody, technically, you might need approval of Security Council. You know what that means, Bob? That means that China has a veto and Russia has a veto, and you never get anything. You can't even get approval to go into Syria because the Chinese will block it. Now, some people might think that at the end of the day, the best guardian for world affairs is the UN. Personally, I would prefer the Americans. At the end of the day, it's a hard world. They're going to make better calls than China and Russia.
The Americans didn't make it the great call. They went into a country
that had... They made a great call on Serbia. Hang on, they made a great call on Serbia.
I'm going to interrupt you because you didn't want to be interrupted yourself.
The Americans went into Iraq. They circumvented United Nations. They went into a country that had very few jihadists and that had a secular, although pretty terrible man, but at least the country was functioning. You cannot say they left it better than when they went in.
Well, I'm not doubting that it was a secular. Dictators tend to keep order. They keep order in Egypt. They keep order in Iraq.
The country was functioning.
If that's your test, then you shouldn't go into any dictator. We just leave dictators alone. Now, it's a hard call, right?
Let's ask Virisila. You actually, I suppose you have had a dictator in your country, so you probably have some idea about that subject. But leaving Fiji out of it, what do you think about what happened in Iraq?
Well, personally, I really don't think they should be going into Iraq. I think we should learn from hindsight. I think that the first time they went in, there was no weapons of mass destruction. And I don't think, if there is a problem there, let the Iraqis sort it out themselves. If they want an intervention, maybe they should use diplomacy. Let's start off with diplomacy first. I think that's extremely important. And I think that Australia, as a leader in the Pacific, I think they need to take, I think this is a bad move on their part. This is showing that if they're going to intervene in Australia using military intervention. Interestingly, we have a dictatorship in our home. Not that I'm saying that I wanted military intervention, but where do you draw the line? Like in some countries you'll have military intervention, and in some countries you won't. You have same dictatorship problems there. The intensity of it is probably not as big as Iraq. But
would it have been different, do you think, if there was oil in Fiji?
That's my point. I think that's the only reason why they go into Iraq is because there is oil.
There was no oil in
Yugoslavia.
Is making money. And I'm betting that Ed's pretty glad the Americans bombed the Serbs. I'm just going out on a limb here. Maybe Ed will correct me on that.
Well, I wouldn't put it... Come on, Jim, I wouldn't put it that way. But certainly there were horrific crimes being enacted. And the Americans did take a leadership role in trying to say, look, we can't have this continue. And they also took a leadership role, particularly through Richard Holbrooke, in negotiating the Dayton Accord and bringing peace to a place that had been troubled. But,
OK, that's a sidebar argument. I'm just going to bring Josh back in with a very simple question. Did Tony Abbott jump the gun by refusing to rule out sending Australian troops back into Iraq?
Well, he hasn't jumped the gun because there's no offer or request on the table.
But isn't that something one would automatically rule out, or is it still on the table to do it?
The Americans have ruled out sending in troops.
Since then they have.
Well, they've ruled out sending troops. But I think what Tony Abbott...
But what if the Americans had said, actually, it'd be quite good if you sent troops and we'll all be in the same foxhole again?
Well, I think we all feel that, and not just at this table, but probably across the country, that we have done our bit in Iraq, and there probably wasn't the stomach to send in troops again. But I think if you think that diplomacy will deal with ISIS, you're very misguided, unfortunately, because this is a group who is carrying out butchery on a major scale. and they want to set up a caliphate that takes in, Jordan, the West Bank, Syria, Iraq, and you've now got Iran who is buying into this because Iran is a Shiite country. And once Iran buys in, then what does Saudi Arabia and Turkey, which are Sunni countries, indeed Egypt with its own problems as Sunni countries. So there is a much bigger issue here.
Sorry, Josh, ISIS is Sunni. Are you saying that Iran is buying into ISIS?
On the other side of the equation.
What I'm saying is, Ali Sistani and Muqtada al-Sadr and other Shiite figures, indeed, Nouri al-Maliki is a Shiite leader in Iraq, and they are calling for Iranian help, and Iran has sent in revolutionary guards. Now, this is a real problem, and just for people watching this, it does affect Australia, because we have had Australians go and volunteer in Syria. It's an issue which is of great security concern to the Australian government. If Iraq fragments, then this is a broader field for these people to go into. And then, as a country, we become less safe and our interests become less safe.
Okay, just to go back to the original question, though, should Australia take any responsibility at all, along with the United States, for the fragmentation of Iraq that you just talked about, for the consequences of that war?
Well, I think you have to look at what has happened. You've had Nouri al-Maliki, who hasn't done anyone a service.
No, that was a simple question, though.
But because what I'm saying is it's not what actually transpired immediately after the invasion and the occupation. The fragmentation of Syria has helped bring about this in Iraq, because there's been the flow of fighters from Syria into Iraq, there's been the bad governance in Iraq. These are the major factors which has created the current situation.
We must move on. We've got to get to other questions. Our next question, in fact, is from Phil Jones.
How appropriate is it for the Australian government to describe the West Bank and East Jerusalem as disputed territories rather than occupied territories? And doesn't this reinforce the notion that might is right in international disputes?
Start with Dee Madigan.
Okay, what this does illustrate is just how powerful words are. I know that Brandis said that occupied was a loaded term, and it is. But so too is disputed, because it says that you think that there is value on both sides of the argument. What we've done now by having two possible words we can use, is every single time something like this happens, there will be debate overseas about which word Australia is using. It's opened up a diplomatic minefield that is completely unnecessary and will probably hurt us.
Josh, let's hear what this actually means.
Well, as the Prime Minister, as Julie Bishop, as George Brandis has said, Australia hasn't changed its position, because success, as far as I can recall, Liberal ministers and Prime Ministers have never called it occupied East Jerusalem, and these are subject to negotiations.
No, so can we clarify this? Because in his initial comments, George Brandis certainly didn't distinguish between other occupied territories, that is on the West Bank, for example. Are you now clarifying this and saying he was really only referring to East Jerusalem? Does that mean, in fact, that the West Bank settlements are on occupied territory?
Well, the point about the West Bank and East Jerusalem is that they're going to be part of a deal, and this is our main message.
No, but just very specifically on this question of what's occupied and what is disputed.
Right. Well,
are the West Bank settlements on occupied territory?
No, these territories that we are discussing that were taken by Israel after the '67 war, when it was invaded by Syria, Jordan and Egypt, are now the subject of negotiation to try to get a peace treaty. So that doesn't distinguish between...
But very specifically,
it doesn't distinguish between West Bank...
Are they occupied or disputed territories?
Because we are going down the path saying all of these areas need to be the subject of negotiation.
Yes, but are they occupied or disputed? Does Australia think of the settlements as well as East Jerusalem as being on occupied territory?
As Julie Bishop has said, we don't accept Bob Carr's assessment that all these settlements were illegal. And if you go to our main point here, which is you're only going to get peace in that part of the world if the two sides sit down.
Okay, now, I still don't think you've quite answered that question.
Well, I haven't given you the answer, Tony, that you would like. But what I'm saying is that the only...
But it's a simple question.
Well, you've heard how difficult international law is. We believe as a government that Security Council Resolution 242, which was passed after the 67 war, and 338, which happened after the 1973 war, are the basis for a negotiated solution.
Okay, all right, let's hear from Ed Husic and then the other panellists.
Well, the person who first voiced this view, which, if it is the case, Josh, that, you guys were using these terms behind the scenes, no one else really knew because it came as a shock. And when we first heard that this was the new term, it was being expressed by Attorney General Brandis, who'd done such a fantastic job in championing Reform to Racial Discrimination Act that he decided, well, what's next? I'm going to go on the international sphere and I'm going to inject myself in the most controversial and sensitive issue going in the Middle East. I'm going to change the definition of these territories. I mean, that's worked out a treat.
Well, the thing is,
the actual thing itself is the occupation. The term occupation is not pejorative. It's an internationally legal concept. It refers to areas that are under physical control that are beyond Israel's 1948 borders. So it's not designed to be a gotcha moment of describing or assigning certain rights. It's basically identifying what the rest of the world has classed it as. I mean, if the US, the strongest friend of Israel, is still using the term occupied, and we have our own Attorney General, deciding to class it differently, what is going on? And the consequence of this, putting everything else aside, is people feel so strongly about this that it could actually have an impact on our economic interests. And no one wants that, and let's hope it doesn't get to that point. But we'd certainly hope the coalition, instead of playing
You're talking about the possibility of some sort of trade sanctions against Australia.
And I guess the thing is, we'd hope that the word games that the opposition, or the coalition when they were in opposition, used to play, don't continue on in government, because there's too much at stake, and they really have got to... They said they'd be the adults in the room, and this isn't really a demonstration of that virtue.
But it is worth pointing out that the Americans have said they haven't wanted to use the term occupied. Yes, it's in the Resolution 242 and 338, but when Madeleine Albright, who became the Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, a Democrat, when she was the ambassador to the United Nations for the United States, she said very specifically in 1994, we will not use that term occupied.
Let's, we've got a couple of hands up in the audience. Go to the gentleman in the middle first. Go ahead. Yes, that's you, sir.
I just want to say that in terms of the Australia invaded Iraq for non-compliance with United Nations resolutions. And here we are throwing United Nations resolutions again in terms of the East Jerusalem and the occupied territories. And we call them disputed. We changed that, and so we're not actually recognizing United Nations resolutions anymore.
Let's hear from our other panellists here, and I'll start with Virisila and then I'll go to James. How you listening to this argument, does it make sense to you, first of all?
Well, yeah, not really, because I'm just thinking to myself, I mean, these words occupied, disputed, I mean, the people of the First Nation of Australia would, call Caucasian Australians as occupying Australia. I mean, why is this difference being made? I mean, what is your definition of occupied, and what is your definition of disputed? I mean, yeah, that's what I'm curious about.
We'll throw that in as a rhetorical question, and we'll go to James.
Well, you're going to like this. I agree with about 95% of what Ed said, actually, but I'd like to put it into context for you. Israel is the only democracy in a sea of awful places in the Middle East, and I mean awful. Not only is it a democracy, Palestinians in Israel do better than they do, and just be quiet, will you? They do better than a lot of other places. And in the last, 2 or 3 attempts at peace, basically all of the West Bank has been offered, and it's just seemingly that's not enough. And a lot of these countries don't even recognize Israel. So in that context, Israel gets judged by pretty harsh standards. They don't get judged by anywhere near the same standards as, shall we start, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Iran, even Jordan. So in that context, we are very hard on Israel. If you want an example of that, the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is the leading human rights council for the entire world, makes resolutions and they condemn, various countries for human rights.
James, we're going to run out of time. No, I'm not.
There have been more
you.
resolutions against Israel than every other country on earth put together.
James, I'm just going to bring you back to. You said you agreed with a lot of what Ed said.
He's right. I wouldn't be changing the wording myself. He's totally right.
So on the question of occupied and disputed, you would leave it at occupied, would you?
I don't see what you got.
Okay, we've got one more person up the back who's patiently had his hand up for a while there. Yes, go ahead.
Would like to know how would you consider Israel is the only democracy in the awful Middle East, while the Arab community, the Palestinian community there does not have the same rights, does not have equal rights with the Israelis and with the Jewish community. How can it be democracy within this kind of apartheid regime that we have there?
Okay, Josh, a quick response.
Well, having a Palestinian state, which is a democracy, sitting side by side with Israel as a democracy has to be the goal. It absolutely has to be the goal because these issues have been debated for thousands of years. Australia is this year, the Abbott government, giving $56 million in terms of aid to the Palestinian territories, the most of any government previously in Australia. So we are doing what we can to try to advance this. Now, it's right that in the past there has been peace treaties in the Middle East with Egypt in '79, with Jordan in '94, and Olmert and Barak both offered the area for a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as the capital. Now that was turned back by Arafat. It is hoped, and you saw at the Pope host both the President of Israel and the President of Fatah recently in the Vatican. It is hoped, step by step, we can bring the parties together because the only way both the Palestinians and the Israelis can have true peace and security for their children is a genuine two-state solution.
Okay, we're going to have to move on because we've got a few other questions to get to. Sorry to those people who are still on that subject. Next question is from Mark Manning.
Oh, thanks, Tony. I'll just have to read that. Why has the Australian government lifted sanctions against members of Fiji's illegal regime, knowing some are and have since 2000 been associated with or directly involved in torture, murder and other gross human rights abuses, and even against women? And why then aren't the perpetrators arrested under international law when they set foot on Australian soil?
I'll come to Josh in a minute because he's been talking, but let's go to Virisila first. And was it right, do you think, for Australia to lift sanctions and to offer the opportunity to Baini Marama and others to come to Australia?
Well, I mean, I had the same conversation with Julie Bishop, the Foreign Affairs Minister, when she was in Fiji a couple of months ago. And I asked her the question. I said, why are you raising these travel sanctions? And she said, well, we need to start having conversations and we need to start moving toward democracy. And I agree with that to a point. But I also think that it was too quick. I think that that it's important that the government needs to show that it's making real efforts to ensure that the elections are going to happen in September the 17th. And I think that, and I congratulate the Australian government and the New Zealand government and the Europeans for investing into two independent institutions in Fiji to ensure we're having elections. One is the Electoral Commission and the other is the Office of the Supervisor of Election. And I think these two independent institutions are ensuring that we are on the road to democracy. They see a role for civil society despite the repressive decrees that have come in place. They are trying to work with civil society to ensure that the public are going to make informed decisions to ensure that if they don't support this current government, that they show their protest at the ballot box and vote them out.
You said, James wants to get in, but...
I just want to ask for a question. So if I've got you right, you want to leave dictators in place in the Middle East, but you don't want to remove sanctions against Fiji. That's completely inconsistent.
Sorry?
You earlier said you would
Yes.
leave the dictators in place in the Middle East. You don't want to do anything about them.
No, I don't. I'm saying.
That's what you said,
No,
and
I'm
now you
saying
say
that
you
we
don't want to
shouldn't
remove
We
sanctions
shouldn't
and-
have
Okay, hold
military
on.
interventions, is what I'm
We
saying.
might be talking about cross purposes here. Just very briefly, if Julie Bishop went too soon lifting the sanctions, is there any danger that comes from doing that?
Well, I think that as the person who asked the question, I think that there are people who have who've violated rights. Like, for example, there were military officers involved in taking men to the military barracks, about 2006. They are still free. And some of these people are freely travelling through Australia and they haven't been arrested.
Were you abused in any way? Or
Yes, I was physically and emotionally abused by military officers on Christmas Eve in 2006. And those officers are still free. And I think that...
And free now to visit Australia?
Yes, some of them are actually visiting Australia as diplomats.
Josh Frydenberg, we'll hear from you as a representative of the government on this. Did Julie Bishop go too soon? She lifted sanctions, she lifted travel restrictions, and clearly on some people who've committed abuses, including staging a coup.
Well, absolutely not, because Julie Bishop, and she's been extremely focused on Fiji and our responsibilities, not just in government, but also when she was in opposition, and has worked in conjunction with the New Zealanders. Our belief is we had to break the impasse. For years and years, Australia was becoming isolated from Fiji, but most importantly, there wasn't any movement forward in terms of democracy. And so what we held up our offer to the Fijians was if they could move towards elections, and we do now have a date for elections in mid-September this year. So
and I'm just briefly going to interrupt, just to hear your answer on this question. If it is true that among Fijian diplomats in this country are people that abused the woman sitting next to me, are you comfortable with that?
I'm certainly not comfortable with that.
So what are you going to do about it?
Well, I'm not the foreign minister. I'm sure Julie Bishop, after this show, will look at that exact question. But because we do have a responsibility...
Are you prepared to name the people? I mean, do you want anything done?
No, I do, but I would prefer not airing on television.
Okay, right. And so we have a responsibility as the major country in this part of the world to try to pursue more diplomatic outcomes in places like Fiji. And so therefore, in conjunction with the New Zealanders, and we are the largest aid donor to Fiji, we do have some influence, but we were completely on the outer for years and years and years. And so now we'll hopefully break that impasse.
Okay, let's move on, because we have some more questions. Let's go to one that is on domestic issues from Hamdi Boulis, Dr. Hamdi Boulis.
I agree with Josh totally that this is a tough budget. It is the budget that has to be implemented wisely. And yes, we inherited a problem and we have to fix it now. But I would like to ask a question. Wouldn't it have been more appropriate for the government to make these decisions in association or in consideration with the appropriate bodies and relevant organizations? I'm a GP, general practitioner. I've been practicing for 29 years, looking after the mentally ill, frail, lone patients living at home, nursing home patients, children with foster parents. And I assure you, these patients are the first and the foremost to be hit and disadvantaged by the budget, even with the allowances, proposed allowances in place. Has the government considered the childhood vaccination rate might drop? Patients living alone, lone patients, elderly, living at home or in nursing homes will hesitate before calling a doctor? What about the mentally ill? The care will be compromised, putting the patient at risk to themselves and to the community. How can we go about that?
It's going to be hard to do this, but we need brief answers. Go ahead.
You're right. We have had to cut spending and make some difficult choices. In terms of the Medicare co-payment, the carve-out is the cap on for 10 visits, paying the $7 fee for people who hold a concession card. It might be a surprise to many people here, but there are 8.5 million Australians with a concession card, as well as those who are under 16. we needed some form of price signal because the cost to the budget of Medicare about 10 years ago was around $10 billion. Now it's nearly $20 billion. In the coming decade, it'll be $32 billion. It's rising exponentially and somebody has to pay for it. So ensuring a modest co-payment when we have that for the PBS, when Labor tried to introduce it under Hawke, we think it's the right way forward.
I'm just going to quickly go back to our question before I bring the panellists in. That's the answer. You've probably heard it a number of times from politicians.
That's right, but I'm still not convinced. The whole system, the whole newly proposed budget, when it comes to the medical care, will compromise at least 10%, if not 20%, the most disadvantaged sector of our society. Okay. Why not put a cap on any rise on Medicare or doctor's visit, pathology, radiology, and let the healthcare profession absorb the inflation over the next 7 years?
Can I just ask a quick question of you as a questioner? Just judging from what you said at the beginning, it indicated you may well be a Liberal voter, is that correct?
Oh, yes, I am. Definitely, I have been Liberal. I will never change. But at the same time, but at the same time, we have to, and this is democracy. We have to balance.
Okay. Well, the thing is too, this issue, in the way you described it, in terms of regardless of which way you vote, you put on your hat as a GP, and then in my part of Western Sydney, GPs, regardless of what's been described by the government, is that the GPs will actually get a benefit out of this. They're saying, but this is wrong. And the reason they're saying it's wrong is because, not necessarily because of them personally, but because the focus on health has been preventative. That is to get people in to see their GP, to be able to determine if there is a longer-term issue that needs to be dealt with, and to be able to address it. Now, this whole notion of the price signal is very, if I dare, please pardon the pun, is so clinical, because what it's designed to do is stop people seeing the doctor. We have a health minister in this country who thinks his biggest job right now is to stop people going to a doctor. And in return for that, they're saying that with this price signal, it's not going to go repair the budget, it's going to go into this medical fund. And I feel so strongly against this notion that we will squeeze the sick of today to try and fix the sick of tomorrow, and also in the way we do it, and to stop people from seeing the doctor. And just one more thing. Just so you know, I have doctors in Mount Druitt, Glendenning, Rooty Hill, who are saying to me, Woodcroft, who are saying they're sending out SMSs to their patients saying, please come and see us still. This thing isn't going to come in until 2015. See your doctor today. Is this the price signal we want to send?
And it's not just medicine. This budget will reduce the disposable income of our lowest income earning people by 12 to 15%. And yet wealthy people will be affected by less than 1%. Yeah. This is the most unfair budget in Australian history.
Can I just say...
Look, you are largely right, but here's the thing. We can just write off Labor. Their record on the budget is a disaster and the trajectory is terrible. But hang on. It is this Medicare, sending it all to some bogus sort of research is stupid. If we have a problem with the deficit and the debt, the money should go into the debt. And the fact they're not doing that is really, it's an awful way to do it. You're also right that one of the groups that is the least expensive to the budget is GPs. Their cost in real terms has not gone up in 4 or 5 years. We have a hospitalization rate that's twice Canada's. We spend huge amounts of money on all sorts of parts of the health sector. GPs are probably the one area where we get value for money. So, we can argue about it. We need to do something about it. Labor, Wayne Swan promised a surplus every time he got up and gave a budget. He never came close. And I think you have to go back to the 1970s. I'm not making this up. To find a Labor government that delivered a surplus budget. That's how far back you have to go.
Wrong. Can I just say, what's missing in this whole debate about fairness? The absolute thing, and don't just take the Medicare co-payment, look what we're doing on pensions, on the family tax benefit, look at all these things. If you keep making spending commitments and promises and running up debt, it has to be paid. And it's $25,000 for every man, woman and child. Now, it's
but
probably
you're not paying it back for 5 or 6 years. But you backloaded everything.
No. We are under this budget. We're under this budget, James, taking the budget deficit from $49.9 billion today to just $2.8 billion in 2017-18.
All past the next election.
Okay,
well, hopefully still going to be there.
Can I just say, just on the logic of that, and let's say everyone accepts the logic of what you're saying, why then, if you have a co-payment, do you not put it into the medical system?
Well, because we believe Australia has a cutting-edge in medical research.
Okay, all right.
And that is something that plays...
I'm sorry, we've got time for one very last question. It relates to Joe Hockey's budget. It comes from Gillian Harricks.
It's a question for Dee. Clearly this budget has been a challenge for the coalition to sell. What's one piece of advice you'd give them on how to sell it better on social media?
Just one.
Just one.
There is actually nothing you can do because you can't roll everything in glitter, and this budget is shit.
That's a tough one to leave the program on, but I'm afraid it is. I'm being told we're over time. That is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Josh Frydenberg, Dee Madigan, Virisila, Buadromo, Ed Husic and James Allan. Thank you. And next Monday on Q&A, we're leaving daily politics aside to discuss some big picture ideas for the nation. Joining the panel, businessman Mark Carnegie, who's calling for a system of compulsory civilian conscription. Former Labor leader Mark Latham, who broke with party politics and now wants to take the politics out of climate policy. Business Council Chairman Tony Shepherd, who led the National Commission of Audit to bring government revenue and spending back in balance, and social analyst Eva Cox, whose Boyer lectures called for Australia to build a stronger civil society. Until next week's Q&A, good night.